there is going to be a clash of interests in a suggested world for the citizens to participate, right? There will be a hierarchical world on the side government. Therefore, I'm very proud to oppose the complicated case of side government. Today in my speech, I'll be mainly focusing on my arguments. Rebuttals will be integrated in my speech, and let me tell you why side government has a worse case, right? Starting with my first argument, why there will be more accountabilities in the status quo with political parties and how they're more accountable than the individual politicians. Subpoint A. Even if we abolish group and factional will still appear, right? Like Jimoto has their own habatsu. These factions exist on either side of the world. But in their world, these factions will be hidden. They can secretly form these groups, and it is hard for voters to get the agendas, right? At least political parties are public and transparent. They need to explicitly state what they interest in and what they support, like agriculture, guns, tourism, etc. The budget allocation is clear, and this is better on our side. Now, subpoint B, individual politicians can make the connections. Like individual politicians can make connections with this. It's like NRA and people. People will not know about it, right? And it is not transparent. Moving on to subpoint C, the chances of mitigation. In the status quo where political party exists, there is to some certain amount of place for mitigation on both roads. It means that one party gets to decide what is best for people and will limit the amount of personal opinions. Summarize and congregate all the interests of the members. They have the power to create actual policy and deal and law. Members of the political party are willing to make congress, right? Rather than just interest representing for different beliefs. This goes against their point about how individual members will get to speak more about their individual beliefs, right? Ultimately, we think that these individual beliefs are crucially harmful to the political system since they will not be compromising for any other thing, and they would potentially make arguments or policies that can be harmful to a certain minority group, right? This cannot be mitigated on their side of the house because they're allowing individuals to run for offices, and they're regretting the entire political party, right? For example, Japan and Malaysia, where people can compromise on having parties in parliaments, it is impossible to have individuals deliver their policies with no allies. I will expand upon that point later. It will make the entire system harder, right? Members understand the importance of enforcing actual policies for everyone except what they want instead of just individual policies, right? And philosophies, right? Individual politicians, on the other hand, don't have the power to create bill and legislation. It is hard for them to reach any democratic consensus, right? Now, subpoint D. More support from other members equals to more power. As I have stated earlier, Japan and Malaysia are the crucial example where people can compromise on having parties in parliaments, and it is important to have a party supporting their back because in state of national emergency or in state of an emergency, it is exactly these parties that has each other's back and deal with these issues, right? They have more power to make policies because it is the union of people. That's the role of parliament, right? In party, there's a hierarchical system, so there's a head of party who has to congregate all the interests of the members. So they have the power to actually create actual laws and bills. In emergency, it is easier in our case. For example, 911, Fukushima, COVID, national emergencies. Parties have an efficient way of solving rather than different people who are going to advocate for different things, right? Now, moving on to the second argument, why not having political parties are going to cause a less efficient system. Subpoint A, political participation. It is important to understand that in the status quo, where the younger generation are becoming more and more disassociated with political parties, this basically means that in the government world, they'll provide a worse world in which they will be reducing the incentives in participating in politics, even way more significant than the status quo, where people are already disassociated and are stopping to participate, right? First, let me talk about why political parties are good for the incentives compared to the government side. It is easier to understand in the current system because there's a significant and identifiable clash in which people can choose from, right? Such as Hillary versus Trump or Biden versus Trump. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party has a clear clash in which people can identify easily, right? There will be more understanding of the core issues rather than nitpicking the small details which the individual politicians will be suggesting. It is harder for the people to elect leaders and so on. However, comparing it to the opponent side, if individuals are running different manifestos, this means that individual voters will be harder to choose from it, right? In the case of individual politicians running for office, there are going to be different manifestos. They would have the incentives to differentiate their policies from others, which will create a more extreme policies or more quote-unquote unique policies to distinguish them from anyone else. Ultimately, this is harmful because they will drive their manifesto and case onto a point where they have really extreme ideas in order for them to be identified, right? Even worse, if two politicians are similar and they're running for a similar case, the voters will tend to focus on other aspects such as their appearance and so on, right? We think politics should ultimately and fundamentally never be about things like that. Before entering the silent time, I would like to take a POI if government offers. No? I'll move on then. It will be harder for voters to understand because they don't see this clear distinguish and they'll have to spend more time than the status quo to understand politics, right? Ultimately, it will drive them and their incentive away to not participating into politics. This leads to my second subpoint. Political representation, right? This motion will ultimately lead to disenfranchised groups who are not really capable of understanding and spending time on politics to be driven away. In the status quo, and a couple months ago, when Joe Biden and Trump are running for the different political parties, they have a clear clash. And even for the people who does not necessarily spend much time on the political matter, they will be able to engage in political discussions based on their political parties that they support, right? However, on the government case, the uneducated or the ones who does not necessarily have the time to get educated, which typically are the people in the minority groups, will be in a disadvantage. Therefore, the representation, the rich people are going to be the ones who get the advantage in their scenario because they're going to be the ones who has a leisure time and who has time to spend on educating themselves with political matter, right? This decreases the representation of minority groups, and my partner will expand upon that. Outcome is more important because in our world, there are more voices representing the minority groups, and it is an easier system in which people can identify each party easily and the core issues easily. For the above, we proudly oppose. Thank you.
3, 2, 1. We want justice. We want a system that actually keeps people accountable. So proud to oppose. 3 things in my speech for you. 1, responses. 2, extensions. 3, two-word analysis to clearly show you what we have taken to upright in this debate. First, 5 refutations. Firstly, they tell us about how we're destroying democracy. Once again, no mechanization here, and our first speaker already told you about why this is not true because of the accountability system that I'll also be explaining more throughout my speech. Second, they tell you about how they can get people's opinions because they need support. This is extremely funny to us because how will individual politicians with no backup from big institutions even have the power to get support in the first place? We also already told you that these politicians don't have the money to even run in the first place. So the only ones that will be running are the ones who are the majority, who are the rich and white people in opposition's world. However, in our world, people's opinions don't get ignored because the politicians know whatever they're going to do is going to get checked and balanced by their own party and by the other party in parliamentary governments, and that their actions can directly harm the image of their party in the long run, which once again is more accountability. Thirdly, they tell you about how politicians and parties can get protected. However, they completely fail to analyze the status quo because this just simply isn't how the current governmental system works. We have several branches, not just one strong person that controls the entire government. That's totalitarianism. And this debate is not about democracy versus communism. Please stop driving the debate away from what it's supposed to be. Fourthly, they'll tell you about how organized means that different ideas will be cut off. Once again, absolutely zero mechanization here. They never tell you why this is so. And secondly, politicians can join the party that they support, and that's the whole point of having a party system in the first place. So we find this point absolutely ridiculous. Lastly, they tell you about how politicians can have the same idea. As my PM mentioned to you, no engagement here once again, we're telling you that the fact that they can have the same ideas and form secret coalitions in itself is what's harmful, because in their world, politicians that have the same ideas will not be transparent about it. We don't know what kind of conversations they're having behind our backs. We don't know what kind of treaty they're doing with money or with any kind of incentive behind our backs, right? But we're telling them that our world, political parties have to be transparent, and that's why our world is fundamentally so much better than their world. Ultimately, Chair, in their world, no policies will be created in the first place, as our whip speaker POI, because there will be zero change simply apart from the witch-right politicians, because no minority figure has the power or the money or the resources to actually do anything. They don't have the power of numbers of people to be able to create actual change, and we don't see how opposition's world can ever be better than our side of the world. Now some extensions from my first speaker. Our first extension is about how the separation of power creates a better function due to the check and balance system, which I also incorporated a little bit in my refutations. Our political party is divided up into 3 parts. That's what keeps the check and balance system. For example, the parliament is the legislation, the cabinet scrutinizes and observes the president, right? In UK, for parliamentary governmental systems, the 2 parties keep each other in check and balance, and simply we ask you one thing: who will keep the individual politicians accountable? Who will scrutinize them? Who will make sure that they're not doing these kinds of things? And what kind of check and balance system that is already working and existing on opposition side is there that is going to actually be effective? We see no mechanization, no explanation on this. Once again, no true analysis. And why is our side comparatively better? Well, this is because our side can create less extremist policies, and because of this working system of check and balance that we've already seen works in the status quo, which is why our side is much more effective, our side is much more realistic, and we don't live in a utopia like the opposition side. Second extension is about minorities. Chair, simply speaking, the chances in their world of a politician that doesn't support minorities is bigger. We tell you the risk on their side that people that don't support minorities getting elected, people that do extremist policies against minorities, is too big. 3 layers of analysis here is 1, the rich people versus the poor people. People who are poor in their world can't even participate or go in the elections anyways. The thing is, participating in an election can cost so much, right? Because you need office, you need staff, you need advertising, you need political connections. We tell you that simply the gap between the rich and the poor that exists in the status quo, we tell you that it is impossible for poor people to get elections, to get even elected or even get into the political atmosphere in the first place. In our world, we tell you that poor individuals can get support from bigger parties who can fund them and allow them to state their views and make actual changes. We see this, for example, like AOC in the United States, right? She worked as a server before she got involved with the Democratic Party, but now that she has this kind of party, she can speak her voice in parliament, and she's making huge changes to our society right now. Second layer of analysis is about racial minorities versus racial majority. The chance of a leader that supports racial minorities getting voted into power is extremely rare in proposition's world. Firstly, because there's a huge lack of minorities that go for these roles in the first place, and secondly, even if they do, majority of voters are the majority. Thus, they tend to vote for the people who are their own race and people that support policies that are beneficial for them, because once again, people are ultimately selfish, right? For example, in Japan, we see how politicians who are actively against Koreans and protecting them in the status quo still get voted, because the majority of people in Japan are Japanese and don't really care about Koreans. We see how in the United States, the majority of voter turnout is white because they inherently have a better education system, because Black people live in more rural areas and have poorly funded education. This in opposition's world, only racial majorities get to be represented, and there's a high chance for racial minorities to not get any representation in parliament or in government, and we tell that this is inherently harmful because these minorities deserve this kind of representation. In our world, this is completely flipped, right? Because parties hire people of various races for their public image. For example, we see AOC in the United States, right? In parties, it is not always about just the people who get voted, and it is also about, in parties, it's not just always about the people's votes. And for example, have like state representatives, like electoral votes and stuff like that, right? We also once again tell you that these minority politicians get power from parties, like Obama got help from the Republican Party to get power, right? We don't see how this can ever happen inside opposition's world. Furthermore, it is much harder for individuals to have connections and have power to create coalition, right? Our PM already told you about Malaysia, how Chinese parties have coalition, how Japan has coalition. Individuals simply don't have these kind of connections with other countries to create coalition. Why is this so important? My PM already gave you a very extensive explanation of how this is going to be more effective in times of crisis, like earthquakes, times of crisis like terrorism and things like that, and how in humanitarian crisis we significantly need to choose the side that's going to give you a more speedy recovery, going to give you a more fast recovery, and that's going to be the most effective, because that's the whole fundamental part of how we decide what a good and bad politician is in the first place, right? Third layer of analysis is about women and men. In their world, because once again, men tend to vote more because they live in a more like highly educated system and things like that, there's a high chance that politics will be essentially male dominated, where it is already male dominated right now. We're telling that this gets significantly worse on opposition side of the world, because 1, more males get higher education in the first place. 2, studies like politics are highly male dominated, for example in college courses. And 3, the women in the status quo are very encouraged, the narrative in society, not participated in politics because it's seen as too pushy, because they get seen as outspoken, right? A field that's already full of men is going to be even more dominated. We see that simply this is a huge lack of representation of women women that they need to be involved in. Thus, in their role, politics will be exclusionary, meaning minority representation will not exist, and there's a high chance of racism towards them. We also think that this perpetuates the narrative that only majorities can participate and be powerful leaders. We need our children and future generations to have a role model of minorities that they can look up to. We tell you that in our world, less privileged people also get a chance of politics. We give representation, like AOC and Obama, and we give representation to people like Black women in the United States. Like the Black vice president in the United States is Black, and she's a woman, right? How do you think that this could have ever happened in their side of the world? We tell you it's not, because ultimately our side has to take the debate, because we support the most vulnerable stakeholders, which are the minorities, and the government has a responsibility to reciprocate the harm that they have done in the past to these minorities, which is why we are so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. We don't think political party is a perfect system. However, it is a better and more inclusive system compared to atomized individual politicians competing one another without having a uniting power to enact concrete policy. Proposition cannot win this debate just by criticizing the defect of a party structure. Their burden is to show why disorganized and fragmented parliament will be better off. I don't think they have sufficiently demonstrated it. Based on that, I'd like to answer 3 questions in this debate. 1. Which side can reduce unproductive power dynamics in parliament? 2. Which side can accelerate better political participation by voters? 3. Which side can present a more inclusive policy outcome to wider range of stakeholders? So moving on to the first question of this debate. Which side can reduce unproductive power dynamics in parliament? 3 levels of counter analysis. Number 1. Our leader of opposition explained that less accountable grouping and factioning is likely to occur on the government paradigm, and voters can't see what's going on behind the scene. Only response from Deputy Prime Minister is that is good, because politicians are making efforts to implement the manifesto in favor of supporters. But the problem is it's all invisible. You can't see what kind of factions are going on, what kind of specific interests they are defended. The problem is malfeasant relationship might be reinforced. We are talking about construction company, we are talking about National Life Association, we are talking about agricultural union. Now, under our model in a party structure, they have an obligation to publicize the agenda. They need to publicize what kind of relationship they maintain with the interest group. At least voters are able to make more informed choice about democratic election. I think we can mitigate that kind of risk of malfeasance and unaccountable activities on our side of the house. So in terms of accountability, our approach is much better compared to disorganized factioning and grouping model. Second of all, our hierarchy. The Deputy Prime Minister explained that hierarchical structure inside the parliament is toxic culture. We think that is good. Hierarchy means that the party has an ability to congregate issues and enforce and enact concrete policies in a timely manner. It's critical to combat emerging cases like COVID-19 or natural disaster or war and intervention. Therefore, we believe uniting power and a hierarchical structure is great in that it encourages party to congregate policy and issues in timely manner. Compared to that, inefficient congregation is the problem of atomized individual model. Politicians advocating for countervailing views, thereby it's hard to reach any legislative consensus. Only response from Deputy Prime Minister is that the politicians make concessions because they can see common interests and overlapping interests. No, because resource is limited, it's always zero-sum game. We are talking about limited budget, limited discussion time in parliament. Therefore, politicians have a propensity to prioritize their own personal agenda and philosophy over trying to create a common interest among them. That is why making concession is systematically infeasible in the case of atomized politicians advocating for different agenda. Number 3. Hierarchical, even if we concede that the hierarchical structure exists in political parties, they don't have incentive to exclude countervailing views for no better reasons. They have incentive to include minorities, opinions, and marginal groups inside the political agenda. Why? Because their interest and priority is to maximize support, gain popularity in order to win next election sustainably. For example, in even Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, the female interests were marginal and minorities inside the party, but they had an incentive to include that. Therefore, they expanded the coverage of medical expenditure to infertility treatment. This is the kind of example in which even interest of minority groups are better represented or sufficiently included inside the parliament structure. Therefore, on our side of the house, we can better reduce unproductive dynamics inside the parliament. Moving on to the second clash points, which side can accelerate better political participation? 2 points. 1, Our Prime Minister explained that overflow of information and manifesto disincentivizes voters to engage with politics in the first place. Yes, we agree that choice is not enough. The number of choices are not infinite. However, it's better to elucidate and highlight important issues so that wider range of people are incentivized to engage with political discussion to begin with. Let me explain the spectrum of voters. We believe vast majority of voters are not hard conservative or hard libertarian or hard liberals. But many people are like swing voters. They are open-minded. They're flexible to change their political position. For those kind of people, it's better to frame political agenda in a simplified manner so that they are able to digest important information and get more interested and incentivized to take part in political discourse to begin with. Secondly, who takes part in political election and discourse on the government paradigm? As my deputy leader of opposition explained that those who have literacy, those who have educational background are able to select necessary information and digest disproportionate amount of agenda and manifesto. So best case let me engage with the best case scenario from the government bench by utilizing this analysis. Yes, you can choose your best candidate, you can choose your best leader, but who have ability to choose the best leader among juxtaposition of random candidates on the government model? Only those who have literacy, only those who have ability to digest information are able to choose the best leader who can represent their interests. Vast majority of uneducated and socially disadvantaged groups will be left off, and that's the system, and that's the outcome of government policy. Therefore, even in the best case scenario, the only response from the government whip is that the poor people have time. They have time to read a newspaper. I doubt that they are working very hard for their subsistence. At least it's cruel to expect such an active political engagement from working class people. Thereby, our approach can better accelerate better political participation by voters. Finally, which side can present more inclusive policy outcome? Two things. One, the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister explained that the choices for voters are limited right now. But we contend there are plethora of political parties. Right now, even within political parties, there are diverse candidates advocating for slightly different nuance of politics. For example, even within government of Liberal Democratic Party, Nikaiha and Ishibaha have slightly different agenda. Even within government, in coalition, we have Komeito who are emphasizing a more supportive policy for welfare, unlike LGC. Thereby, sufficient democratic choices are available to voters even right now in the status quo. Secondly, candidates from marginalized groups are less likely to be elected on a proposition model. So discourse is what government emphasizes, but the discourse on government model is likely to be monopolized by privileged politicians whose fathers and mothers are also politicians who are intergenerationally wealthy kind of people. We oppose that kind of political system which is exclusionary. We are happy to oppose. Thank you.
This debate comes to a point where we have two things to discuss. Which side creates a better world and which side amplifies more voices, right? What the government side has failed to do or respond. Why we will create a world with better policies and fundamentally a better world, right? Ultimately, the government case fails to give mechanization on how exactly their side has the best world for each individual, right? They have failed to actually tell us how each politician will have the best policy to put forward. Oftentimes, it is most likely for an individual demand to be declined by the party because they tend to be too ineffective or so on. As our previous POI and LO speech has suggested, it is easier for the policies to come onto a compromise when there are different ideas pushed forward in a party rather than pushing forward a very raw manifesto. What does this mean? This means on our world, there will be more humane and better policies because there will be some extent certain kinds of mitigation before achieving a humane policy. What will the proposition side do, right? They will have individuals running for good policy, but also some bad policies, right? This means that regardless of that the citizens has to choose and elect them no matter their illogical policies. What the proposition side has failed to do at the end of the day is to tell us why ultimately all politicians will have the incentive to run for the most humane policy and why people have the incentive to vote for them when the majority of them will not be represented, right? This brings a detrimental impact upon the will and well-being of each individual and citizens. The impact that we bring is the representation of minorities. The reason why we benefit the minority groups more is because of the representation that we give to them, right? While the proposition side might say that they have more representation on their side of the world because policies will be taken more into account and each individual idea will get a representation. Now, first, we have already told you in the earlier speech about how individual ideas are not equivalent to good ideas and represent at all. Second, we told you that they're going to create a world in which individuals will not be represented because of the fact that the racial dominant and the gender dominant politicians will get more power. That the uneducated will be driven away from actively participating. We need a working system in which a group support the right of people and have a big enough power to amplify those voices, right? This is about the representation of the minorities who governments have a responsibility to protect because they're the ones who have been most damaged by politics and policies in the past. This is justice, right? There are about the two main issues that we saw in today's debate. Now, let me reinforce you the arguments of our team that stayed untouched. They never responded on the efficiency of the system and how individuals will be able to deal with national emergencies. They never responded on how Black women vice president in the US would never have gotten voted if it wasn't for the party system. Same goes for AOC, right? Ultimately, they have never characterized this debate, so we're just assuming that there will be no alliances and individuals will have no support to be productive, no support from the party, right? They'll spend more time on making political decisions. Our impact at the end of the day is way better than the government side because we have a bigger magnitude by including more people, targeting more minority groups, giving them representation in terms of risk and urgency. We give the politicians the most efficient system in which parties will be able to respond faster to the national emergencies and so on. It is simply not enough for them to criticize the status quo. They need to tell us why their world creates a better world than any of the potential changes that we can make to the status quo political system. They never take into account our base case scenario, right? Ultimately, we do not want to repeat history where only rich people have the voice and have the representation. And we want to cater towards the minority groups too, right? Chair, we asked you to step out of the proposition's utopia and recognize the status quo. We recognize that the status quo is not perfect, but it doesn't have to change in the as the proposition's proposal, right? Never been so proud to oppose. Thank you.